Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue our training in good manners with more from Etiquette in society, in business, in politics, and at home by Emily Post, author of Purple and Fine Linen, The Title Market, Woven in the Tapestry, The Flight of a Moth, Letters of a Worldly Godmother, etc., etc., illustrated with private photographs and facsimiles of social forms, first published in 1922 by Funk and Wagnall's Company, New York and London. Let's pick up right where we left off in Chapter 10, Cards and Visits. Let's begin. Not at home. When a servant at a door says, "Not at home," this phrase means that the lady of the house is not at home to visitors. This answer neither signifies nor implies, nor is it intended to, that Mrs. Jones is out of the house. Some people say, "not receiving," which actually means the same thing. But the "not at home" is infinitely more polite, since in the former you know she is in the house but won't see you, whereas in the latter case you have the pleasant uncertainty that it is quite possible she is out. To be told, "Mrs. Jones is at home but doesn't want to see you," would certainly be unpleasant. And to beg to be excused, except in a case of illness or bereavement, has something very suggestive of a cold shoulder. But "not at home" means that she is not sitting in the drawing room behind her tea tray. That and nothing else. She may be out, or she may be lying down, or otherwise occupied. Nor do people of the world find the slightest objection if a hostess, happening to recognize the visitor as a particular friend, calls out, "Do come in, I am at home to you." Anyone who talks about this phrase as being a white lie either doesn't understand the meaning of the words or is going very far afield to look for untruth. To be consistent, these over-literals should also exact that when a guest inadvertently knocks over a teacup and stains a sofa, the hostess, instead of saying, "It is nothing at all, please don't worry about it," ought for the sake of truth to say, "See what your clumsiness has done. You have ruined my sofa." And when someone says, "How are you?" instead of answering, "Very well, thank you," the same truthful one should perhaps take an hour by the clock and mention every symptom of indisposition that she can accurately subscribe to. While "not at home" is merely a phrase of politeness, to say, "I am out," after a card has been brought to you, is both an untruth and an inexcusable rudeness. Or to have an inquiry answered, "I don't know, but I'll see," and then to have the servant, after taking a card, come back with the message, "Mrs. Jones is out," cannot fail to make the visitor feel rebuffed. Once a card has been admitted, the visitor must be admitted also, no matter how inconvenient receiving her may be. You may send a message that you are dressing, but will be very glad to see her if she can wait 10 minutes. The visitor can either wait or say she is pressed for time. But if she does not wait, then she is rather discourteous. Therefore, it is of the utmost importance always to leave directions at the door, such as Mrs. Jones is not at home. Miss Jones will be home at 5 o'clock. Mrs. Jones will be home at 5:30. Or Mrs. Jones is at home in the library to intimate friends, but not at home in the drawing room to acquaintances. It is a nuisance to be obliged to remember either to turn an in and out card in the hall, or to ring a bell and say, "I am going out," and again, "I have come in." But whatever plan or arrangement you choose, no one at your front door should be left in doubt and then repulsed. It is not only bad manners, it is bad housekeeping. The old-fashioned day at home. It is doubtful if the present generation of New Yorkers knows what a day at home is, but their mothers at least remember the time when the fashionable districts were divided into regular sections, wherein on a given day in the week the whole neighborhood was at home. Friday sounds familiar as the day for Washington Square, and was it Monday for Lower Fifth Avenue? At all events, each neighborhood on the day of its own suggested a local fête. Ladies in visiting dresses with trains and bonnets and nose veils and tight gloves, holding card cases, tripped demurely into this house, out of that, and again into another. And there were always many broughams and victorias, slowly exercising up and down, and very smart footmen standing with maroon or tan or fur rugs over their arms in front of Mrs. Wellborn's house, or Mrs. Oldname's, or the big house of Mrs. Toplofty at the corner of Fifth Avenue. It must have been enchanting to be a grown person in those days. Enchanting also were the sea-spring victorias, as was life in general, that was taken at a slow carriage pace, and not at the motor speed of today. The day at home is still in fashion in Washington, and it is ardently to be hoped that it also flourishes in many cities and towns throughout the country, or that it will be revived, for it is a delightful custom, though more in keeping with Europe than America, which does not care for gentle paces once it has tasted swift. A certain young New York hostess announced that she was going to stay home on Saturday afternoons, but the men went to the country and the women to the opera, and she gave it up. There are a few old-fashioned ladies living in old-fashioned houses and still staying at home in the old-fashioned way to old-fashioned friends who for decades have dropped in for a cup of tea and a chat. And there are two maiden ladies in particular, joint chatelaines of an imposingly beautiful old house, where on a certain afternoon of the week, if you come in for tea, you are sure to meet not alone those prominent in the world of fashion, but a fair admixture of artists, scientists, authors, inventors, distinguished strangers, in a word, best society in its truest sense. But days at home such as these are not easily duplicated, for few houses possess a salon atmosphere, and few hostesses achieve either the social talent or the wide cultivation necessary to attract and interest so varied and brilliant a company. Modern card-leaving, a questionable act of politeness. The modern New York fashion in card-leaving is to dash as fast as possible from house to house, sending the chauffeur up the steps with cards, without ever asking if anyone is home. Some butlers announce, "Not at home," from force of habit, even when no question is asked. There are occasions when the visitors must ask to see the hostess, but cards are left without asking whether a lady is at home under the following circumstances. Cards are left on the mother of the bride after a wedding, also on the mother of the groom. Cards are also left after any formal invitation. Having been asked to lunch or dine with a lady whom you know but slightly, you should leave your card whether you accepted the invitation or not, within 3 days if possible, or at least within a week of the date for which you were invited. It is not considered necessary, in New York at least, to ask if she is at home. Promptness in leaving your card is, in this instance, better manners than delaying your party call and asking if she is at home. This matter of asking at the door is one that depends upon the customs of each state and city, but as it is always wiser to err on the side of politeness, it is better policy, if in doubt, to ask, "Is Mrs. Blank at home?" rather than to run the risk of offending a lady who may like to see visitors. A card is usually left with a first invitation to a stranger who has brought a letter of introduction, but it is more polite, even though not necessary, to ask to be received. Some ladies make it a habit to leave a card on everyone on their visiting list once a season. It is correct for the mother of a debutante to leave her card, as well as her daughter's, on every lady who has invited the daughter to her house, and a courteous hostess returns all of these pasteboard visits. But neither visit necessitates closer or even further acquaintance. Visits which everyone must pay. Paying visits differs from leaving cards in that you must ask to be received. A visit of condolence should be paid at once to a friend when a death occurs in her immediate family. A lady does not call on a gentleman, but writes him a note of sympathy. In going to inquire for sick people, you should ask to be received, and it is always thoughtful to take them gifts of books or fruit or flowers. If a relative announces his engagement, you must at once go to see his fiancée. Should she be out, you do not ask to see her mother. You do, however, leave a card upon both ladies, and you ask to see her mother if received by the daughter. A visit of congratulation is also paid to a new mother, and a gift invariably presented to the baby. Messages written on cards. With sympathy, or with deepest sympathy, is written on your visiting card with flowers sent to a funeral. This same message is written on a card and left at the door of a house of mourning if you do not know the family well enough to ask to be received. To inquire is often written on a card left at the house of a sick person, but not if you are received. In going to see a friend who is visiting a lady whom you do not know, whether you should leave a card on the hostess as well as on your friend depends upon the circumstances. If the hostess is one who is socially prominent and you are unknown, it would be better taste not to leave a card on her, since your card afterward found without explanation might be interpreted as an uncalled for visit made in an attempt for a place on her list. If, on the other hand, she is the unknown person and you are the prominent one, your card is polite but unwise unless you mean to include her name on your list. But if she is one with whom you have many interests in common, then you may very properly leave a card for her. In leaving a card on a lady stopping at a hotel or living in an apartment house, you should write her name in pencil across the top of your card to ensure it's being given to her and not to someone else. At the house of a lady whom you know well and whom you are sorry not to find at home, it is friendly to write, "Sorry not to see you," or "So sorry to miss you." Turning down a corner of a visiting card is by many intended to convey that the visit is meant for all the ladies in the family. Other people mean merely to show that the card was left at the door in person and not sent in an envelope. Other people turn them down from force of habit and mean nothing whatever. But whichever the reason, more cards are bent or dog-eared than are left flat. Engraved cards announcing engagement, bad form. Someone somewhere asked whether or not to answer an engraved card announcing an engagement. The answer can have nothing to do with etiquette, since an engraved announcement is unknown to good society. For the proper announcement of an engagement, see page 304. When people see their friends. 5 o'clock is the informal hour when people are at home to friends. The correct hour for leaving cards and paying formal visits is between 3:30 and 4:30. One should hesitate to pay a visit at the tea hour, unless one is sure of one's welcome among the intimates likely to be found around the hostess's tea table. Many ladies make it their practice to be home if possible at 5 o'clock, and their friends who know them well come in at this time. For the afternoon tea table and its customs, see page 171. Informal visiting often arranged by telephone. For instance, instead of ringing her doorbell, Mrs. Norman calls Mrs. Kindheart on the telephone. "I haven't seen you for weeks. Won't you come in to tea or to lunch, just you?" Mrs. Kindheart answers, "Yes, I'd love to. I can come this afternoon." And 5 o'clock finds them together over the tea table. In the same way, young Struthers calls up Millicent Gilding. "Are you going to be in this afternoon?" She says, "Yes, but not until 5:15. He says, "Fine, I'll come then." Or she says, "I'm so sorry, I'm playing bridge with Pauline, but I'll be in tomorrow." He says, "All right, I'll come tomorrow." The younger people rarely ever go to see each other without first telephoning, or since even young people seldom meet except for bridge, most likely it is Millicent Gilding who telephones the Struthers youth to ask if he can't possibly get uptown before 5 o'clock to make a fourth with Mary and Jim and herself. How a first visit is made. In very large cities, neighbors seldom call on each other, but if strangers move into a neighborhood in a small town or in the country, or at a watering place, it is not only unfriendly, but uncivil for their neighbors not to call on them. The older residents always call on the newer, and the person of greatest social prominence should make the first visit, or at least invite the younger or less prominent one to call on her, which the younger should promptly do. Or two ladies of equal age or position may either one say, "I wish you would come to see me," to which the other replies, "I will with pleasure." More usually, the first one offers, "I should like to come to see you if I may," and the other of course answers, "I shall be delighted if you will." The first one, having suggested going to see the second, is bound in politeness to do so. Otherwise, she implies that the acquaintance on second thought seems distasteful to her. Everyone invited to a wedding should call upon the bride on her return from the honeymoon, and when a man marries a girl from a distant place, courtesy absolutely demands that his friends and neighbors call on her as soon as she arrives in her new home. On opening the door to a visitor. On the hall table in every house, there should be a small silver or other card tray, a pad, and a pencil. The nicest kind of pad is one that when folded makes its own envelope, so that a message when written need not be left open. There are all varieties and sizes at all stationers. When the doorbell rings, the servant on duty, who can easily see the chauffeur or lady approaching, should have the card tray ready to present on the palm of the left hand. A servant at the door must never take the card in his or her fingers. Correct number of cards to leave. When the visitor herself rings the doorbell and the message is "not at home," the butler or maid proffers the card tray, on which the visitor lays a card of her own and her daughter's for each lady in the house, and a card of her husband's and son's for each lady and gentleman. But 3 is the greatest number ever left of any one card. In calling on Mrs. Town, who has 3 grown daughters and her mother living in the house, and a Mrs. Stranger staying with her, whom the visitor was invited to a luncheon to meet, a card on each would need a packet of 6. Instead, the visitor should leave 3, 1 for Mrs. Town, 1 for all the other ladies of the house, and 1 for Mrs. Stranger. In asking to be received, her query at the door should be, "Are any of the ladies at home?" Or in merely leaving her cards, she should say, "For all of the ladies." When the caller leaves. The butler or maid must stand with the front door open until a visitor re-enters her motor, or if she is walking, until she has reached the sidewalk. It is bad manners ever to close the door in a visitor's face. When a chauffeur leaves cards, the door may be closed as soon as he turns away. When the lady of the house is at home. When the door is opened by a waitress or a parlor maid, and the mistress of the house is in the drawing room, the maid says, "This way, please," and leads the way. She goes as quickly as possible to present the card tray. The guest, especially if a stranger, lags in order to give the hostess time to read the name on the card. The maid meanwhile moves aside to make room for the approaching visitor, who goes forward to shake hands with the hostess. If a butler is at the door, he reads the card himself, picking it up from the tray, and opening the door of the drawing room announces "Mrs. So-and-so," after which he puts the card on the hall table. The duration of a formal visit should be in the neighborhood of 20 minutes, but if other visitors are announced, the first one, on a very formal occasion, may cut her visit shorter, or if conversation becomes especially interesting, the visit may be prolonged 5 minutes or so. On no account must a visitor stay an hour. A hostess always rises when a visitor enters, unless the visitor is a very young woman or man and she herself elderly, or unless she is seated behind the tea table so that rising is difficult. She should, however, always rise and go forward to meet a lady much older than herself. But she never rises from her tea table to greet a man unless he is quite old. If the lady of the house is at home but upstairs, the servant at the door leads the visitor into the reception room, saying, "Will you take a seat, please?" and then carries the card to the mistress of the house. On an exceptional occasion, such as paying a visit of condolence or inquiring for a convalescent, when the question as to whether he will be received is necessarily doubtful, a gentleman does not take off his coat or gloves, but waits in the reception room with his hat in his hand. When the servant returning says either, "Will you come this way, please?" or "Mrs. Town is not well enough to see anyone, but Miss Alice will be down in a moment," the visitor divests himself of his coat and gloves, which the servant carries as well as his hat out to the front hall. As said before, few men pay visits without first telephoning, but perhaps 2 or 3 times during a winter, a young man, when he is able to get away from his office in time, will make a tea-time visit upon a hostess who has often invited him to dinner or to her opera box. Under ordinary circumstances, however, some woman member of his family leaves his card for him after a dinner or a dance, or else it is not left at all. A gentleman paying visits always asks if the hostess is at home. If she is, he leaves his hat and stick in the hall, and also removes and leaves his gloves and rubbers should he be wearing them. If the hour is between 5 and a half past, the hostess is inevitably at her tea table in the library, to which, if he is at all well known to the servant at the door, he is at once shown without being first asked to wait in the reception room. A gentleman entering a room in which there are several people who are strangers shakes hands with his hostess and slightly bows to all the others, whether he knows them personally or not. He of course shakes hands with any who are his friends, and with all men to whom he is introduced, but with a lady only if she offers him her hand. How to enter a drawing room. To know how to enter a drawing room is supposed to be one of the supreme tests of good breeding, but there should be no more difficulty in entering the drawing room of Mrs. Worldly than in entering the sitting room at home. Perhaps the best instruction would be like that in learning to swim. Take plenty of time, don't struggle, and don't splash about. Good manners socially are not unlike swimming, not the crawl or overhand, but smooth, tranquil swimming, quite probably where the expression "in the swim" came from anyway. Before actually entering a room, it is easiest to pause long enough to see where the hostess is. Never start forward and then try to find her as an afterthought. The place to pause is on the threshold, not halfway into the room. The way not to enter a drawing room is to dart forward and then stand awkwardly bewildered and looking about in every direction. A man of the world stops at the entrance of the room for a scarcely perceptible moment until he perceives the most unencumbered approach to the hostess, and he thereupon walks over to her. When he greets his hostess, he pauses slightly, The hostess smiles and offers her hand. The gentleman smiles and shakes hands, at the same time bowing. A lady shakes hands with the hostess and with everyone she knows who is nearby. She bows to acquaintances at a distance and to strangers to whom she is introduced. How to sit gracefully. Having shaken hands with the hostess, the visitor, whether a lady or a gentleman, looks about quietly, without hurry, for a convenient chair to sit down upon or drop into. To sit gracefully, one should not perch stiffly on the edge of a straight chair, nor sprawl at length in an easy one. The perfect position is one that is easy but dignified. In other days, no lady of dignity ever crossed her knees, held her hands on her hips, or twisted herself sideways, or even leaned back in her chair. Today, all these things are done, and the only etiquette left is on the subject of how not to exaggerate them. No lady should cross her knees so that her skirts go up to or above them. Neither should her foot be thrust out so that her toes are at a knee level. An arm akimbo is not a graceful attitude, nor is a twisted spine. Everyone, of course, leans against a chair back, except in a box at the opera and in a ballroom. But a lady should never throw herself almost at full length in a reclining chair or on a wide sofa when she is out in public. Neither does a gentleman, in paying a formal visit, sit on the middle of his backbone with one ankle supported on the other knee, and both as high as his head. The proper way for a lady to sit is in the center of her chair, or slightly sideways in the corner of a sofa. She may lean back, of course, and easily, her hands relaxed in her lap, her knees together, or if crossed, her foot must not be thrust forward so as to leave a space between the heel and her other ankle. On informal occasions, she can lean back in an easy chair with her hands on the arms. In a ball dress, a lady of distinction never leans back in a chair. One cannot picture a beautiful and high-bred woman wearing a tiara and other ballroom jewels leaning against anything. This is, however, not so much a rule of etiquette as a question of beauty and fitness. A gentleman, also on very formal occasions, should sit in the center of his chair, but unless it is a deep, lounging one, he always leans against the back and puts a hand or an elbow on its arms. Postscripts on visits. A lady never calls on another under the sponsorship of a gentleman unless he is her husband or father. A young girl can very properly go with her fiancé to return visit paid to her by members or friends of his family, but she should not pay an initial visit unless to an invalid who has written her a note asking her to do so. If, when arriving at a lady's house, you find her motor at the door, you should leave your card as though she were not at home. If she happens to be in the hall or coming down the steps, you say, "I see you are going out, and I won't keep you." If she insists on you coming in, you should stay only a moment. Do not, however, fidget and talk about leaving. Sit down as though your leaving immediately were not on your mind, but after 2 or 3 minutes say goodbye and go. A young man may go to see a young girl as often as he feels inclined and she cares to receive him. If she continually asks to be excused, or shows him scant attention when he is talking to her, or in any other way indicates that he annoys or bores her, his visits should cease. It is very bad manners to invite one person to your house and leave out another with whom you are also talking. You should wait for an opportunity when the latter is not included in your conversation. In good society, ladies do not kiss each other when they meet, either at parties or in public. It is well to remember that nothing more blatantly stamps an ill-bred person than the habit of patting, nudging, or taking hold of people. Keep your hands to yourself might also be put at the head of the first chapter of every book on etiquette. Be very chary of making any such remarks, as I am afraid I have stayed too long, or I must apologize for hurrying off, or I am afraid I have bored you to death talking so much. All such expressions are self-conscious and stupid. If you really think you are staying too long, or leaving too soon, or talking too much, don't. An invalid's visit by proxy. It is not necessary that an invalid make any attempt to return the visits to her friends, who are attentive enough to go often to see her. But if a stranger calls on her, particularly a stranger who may not know that she is always confined to the house, it is correct for a daughter or sister, or even a friend, to leave the invalid's card for her, and even to pay a visit should she find a hostess at home. In this event, the visitor by proxy lays her own card as well as that of the invalid on the tray proffered her. Upon being announced to the hostess, she naturally explains that she is appearing in place of her mother, or whatever relation the invalid is to her, and that the invalid herself is unable to make any visits. A lady never pays a party call on a gentleman, but if the gentleman who has given a dinner has his mother or sister staying with him, and if the mother or sister chaperone the party, cards should of course be left upon her. Having risen to go, go. Don't stand and keep your hostess standing while you say goodbye and make a last remark last half an hour. Few Americans are so punctilious as to pay their dinner calls within 24 hours, but it is the height of correctness and good manners. When a gentleman whose wife is away accepts someone's hospitality, it is correct for his wife to pay the party call with or for him, since it is taken for granted that she would have been included had she been at home. In other days, a hostess thought it necessary to change quickly into a best dress if important company rang her doorbell. A lady of fashion today receives her visitors at once in whatever dress she happens to be wearing, since not to keep them waiting is the greater courtesy. Chapter 11. Invitations, Acceptances, and Regrets. The formal invitation. As an inheritance from the days when Mrs. Brown presented her compliments and begged that Mrs. Smith would do her the honor to take a dish of tea with her, we still, notwithstanding the present flagrant disregard of old-fashioned convention, send our formal invitations, acceptances, and regrets in the prescribed punctiliousness of the third person. All formal invitations, whether they are to be engraved or to be written by hand, and their acceptances and regrets are invariably in the third person, and good usage permits of no deviation from this form. Wedding invitations. The invitation to the ceremony is engraved on the front sheet of white notepaper. The smartest at present is that with a raised margin, or plate mark. At the top of the sheet, the crest, if the family of the bride has the right to use one, is embossed without color. Otherwise, the invitation bears no device. The engraving may be in script, block, shaded block, or Old English. The invitation to the ceremony should always request the honor of your presence and never the pleasure of your company. Honor is spelled in the old-fashioned way, with a U instead of without. Enclosed in 2 envelopes. 2 envelopes are never used except for wedding invitations or announcements, but wedding invitations and all accompanying cards are always enclosed first in an inner envelope that has no mucilage on the flap and is superscribed Mr. and Mrs. Jameson Greatlake, without address. This is enclosed in an outer envelope which is sealed and addressed. To those who are only asked to the church, no house invitation is enclosed. The proper form for an invitation to a church ceremony is, Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Mary Catherine to Mr. James Smartlington on Tuesday the 1st of November at 12 o'clock at St. John's Church in the city of New York. The size of invitations is 5 1/8 inch wide by 7 3/8 inch deep. When the parents issued the invitations for a wedding at a house other than their own, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Littlehouse request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Betty to Mr. Frederick Robinson on Saturday the 5th of November at 4 o'clock at the house of Mr. and Mrs. Sterlington, Tuxedo Park, New York, RSVP. No variation is permissible in the form of a wedding invitation. Whether 50 guests are to be invited or 5,000, the paper, the engraving, and the wording, and the double envelope are precisely the same. In cities, or wherever the general public is not to be admitted, a card of about the size of a small visiting card is enclosed with the church invitation. Please present this card at St. John's Church on Tuesday the 1st of November. To the family and very intimate friends who are to be seated in especially designated pews, enclose a card. Please present this to an usher, pew number blank, on Thursday the 9th of May. Engraved pew cards are ordered only for very big weddings, where 20 or more pews are to be reserved. The more usual custom, at all small and many big weddings, is for the mother of the bride and the mother of the bridegroom each to write on her personal visiting card, Pew number 7, Mrs. John Huntington Smith, 4 West 36th Street. A card for the reserved enclosure, but no especial pew, is often inscribed within the ribbons. Invitation to the house. The invitation to the breakfast or reception following the church ceremony is engraved on a card to match the paper of the church invitation, and is the size of the latter after it is folded for the envelope. Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. James Greatlake's company on Tuesday the 1st of November at half after 4 o'clock at 4 West 36th Street, RSVP. Ceremony and reception invitation in one. Occasionally, especially for a country wedding, The invitation to the breakfast or the reception is added to the one to the ceremony. Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Chatterton request the honor of Mr. and Mrs. Worldly's presence at the marriage of their daughter Hester to Mr. James Town, Jr. on Tuesday the 1st of June at 3 o'clock at St. John's Church and afterwards at Sunny Lawn, Ridgefield, RSVP. Or the invitation reads, at 12 o'clock at St. John's Church and afterwards at breakfast at Sunny Lawn, but afterwards to the reception at Sunny Lawn is wrong. The invitation to a house wedding is precisely the same, except that at Sunny Lawn or at 4 West 36th Street is put in place of at St. John's Church, and an invitation to stay on at the house to which the guest is already invited is not necessary. The train card. If the wedding is to be in the country, a train card is enclosed. A special train will leave Grand Central Station at 12:45 p.m., arriving at Ridgefield at 2:45. Returning, train will leave Ridgefield at 5:10 p.m., arriving New York at 7:02 p.m. Show this card at the gate. Invitation to reception and not to ceremony. It sometimes happens that the bride prefers none but her family at the ceremony and a big reception. This plan is chosen where the mother of the bride or other very near relative is an invalid. The ceremony may take place at a bedside, or it may be that the invalid can go down to the drawing room with only the immediate families and is unequal to the presence of many people. Under these circumstances, the invitations to the breakfast or reception are sent on sheets of note paper like that used for church invitations, but the wording is, Mr. and Mrs. Grantham Jones request the pleasure of your company at the wedding breakfast of their daughter Muriel and Mr. Burlingham Ross, Jr. on Saturday the 1st of November at 1 o'clock at 4 East 38th Street. The favor of an answer is requested. The pleasure of your company is requested in this case instead of the honor of your presence. The written wedding invitation. If a wedding is to be so small that no invitations are engraved, the notes of invitation should be personally written by the bride. Sally dear, our wedding is to be on Thursday the 10th at 12:30, Christ Church Chantry. Of course we want you and Jack and the children, and we want all of you to come afterward to Aunt Mary's for a bite to eat and to wish us luck. Affectionately, Helen. Wedding announcements. If no general invitations were issued to the church, an announcement engraved on note paper, like that of the invitation to the ceremony, is sent to the entire visiting list of both the bride's and the groom's family. Mr. and Mrs. Maynard Barnes have the honor to announce the marriage of their daughter Priscilla to Mr. Eben Hoyt Lemming on Thursday the 26th of April, 1922, in the city of New York. The second marriage invitations. Invitations to the marriage of a widow, if she is very young, are sent in the name of her parents, exactly as were the invitations to her first wedding, excepting that her name, instead of being merely Priscilla, is now written Priscilla Barnes Lemming, thus, Mr. and Mrs. Maynard Barnes request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Priscilla Barnes Lemming, to, etc. Announcements for a young widow's marriage are also the same as for a first wedding. Mr. and Mrs. Maynard Barnes have the honor to announce the marriage of their daughter, Priscilla Barnes Lemming, to Mr. Worthington Adams, etc. But the announcement of the marriage of a widow of maturer years is engraved on notepaper and reads, Mrs. Priscilla Barnes Lemming and Mr. Worthington Adams have the honor to announce their marriage on Monday the 2nd of November at Saratoga Springs, New York. Cards of address. If the bride and groom wish to inform their friends of their future address, especially in cities not covered by the social register, it is customary to enclose a card with the announcement, Mr. and Mrs. Worthington Adams will be at home after the 1st of December at 25 Alderney Place. Or merely their visiting card with their new address in the lower right corner. Invitation to wedding anniversary. For a wedding anniversary celebration, the year of the wedding and the present year are usually stamped across the top of an invitation. Sometimes the couple's initials are added. 1898 to 1922. Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Johnson request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Norman's company at the 25th anniversary of their marriage on Wednesday the 1st of June at 9 o'clock, 24 Austin Avenue, RSVP. Answering a wedding invitation. An invitation to the church only requires no answer whatever. An invitation to the reception or breakfast is answered on the first page of a sheet of notepaper, and although it is written by hand, the spacing of the words must be followed as though they were engraved. This is the form of acceptance. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Gilding, Jr. accept with pleasure Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith's kind invitation for Tuesday the 1st of June. The regret reads, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Brown regret that they are unable to accept Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith's kind invitation for Tuesday, the 1st of June. And with that conclusion to the proper form of wedding invitations and replies, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Etiquette by Emily Post. I'm so glad I finally know how to sit down. Whatever did I do without that information? I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the actual forms of these invitations as they should be written, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.